It's 1942. The United States Navy is in trouble. German U-boats are sinking American ships in the Atlantic at a rate nobody wants to talk about publicly. Convoys carrying supplies, fuel, weapons, medicine, gone. Sailors who enlisted to defend their country are at the bottom of the ocean. Torpedoes that were supposed to hit their targets were being jammed, blocked, their radio signals intercepted and scrambled before the weapons ever reached their mark. Engineers at the Navy were stumped. Admirals were losing sleep. Congressional committees were asking uncomfortable questions in closed sessions, and somewhere across the country, in the bright lights and cocktail parties of Hollywood, a woman in a stunning evening gown is sitting at a desk covered in technical drawings, blueprints, and circuit diagrams. Not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone took her seriously, but because she understood something that every single one of those engineers did not. And she had been carrying that secret inside her head for years, just waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Nobody listened, not at first. They looked at her face, the most photographed face in America, and they laughed. Quietly and politely, the way powerful men laugh when they want you to know your place, without actually saying it out loud. She was Hedy Lamarr. She was a movie star. She was, according to every major newspaper and magazine and radio program in the English-speaking world, the most beautiful woman alive. And that was supposed to be enough for her. That was supposed to be the whole story. That was the box they had put her in. The box they had printed on posters and sold to the public, and the box they fully expected her to stay in for the rest of her natural life. It wasn't. This is the story of a woman who sat across the table from some of the most dangerous arms dealers and military minds in Europe while she was still a teenager, soaked up everything they said, filed it away in that remarkable brain of hers, and then escaped to the other side of the world to use that knowledge to help win the most destructive war in human history. This is the story of a woman who invented a technology so far ahead of its time that the military couldn't even understand it. A technology that the Navy shelved and ignored for 20 years. 20 years? And when they finally figured out what she'd given them, it was too late to pay her a single dime. This is the story of a woman whose name you know for the wrong reasons. Because here's what most guys don't know, and I'm telling you. If you're a history guy, if you love World War II, if you think you know the big names and the big moments, this one is going to rewrite something in your brain today. Hedy Lamarr didn't just sit around looking pretty while men won the war. She handed them a weapon they didn't deserve and wouldn't appreciate for decades. And she did it while also being the biggest movie star on the planet. That's the kind of story that makes your jaw drop, and that's exactly the kind of story we're telling right here, right now. So, settle in, because this one's going to take a while. And I promise you, every single minute of it is worth your time. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler on November 9, 1914, in Vienna, Austria. If you know anything about Vienna in 1914, you know it was one of the most civilized and intellectually rich cities on earth, a place where culture and science and art mixed together in coffee houses and concert halls and libraries in a way that was uniquely European, uniquely of that particular moment before the modern world tore itself apart. Vienna in the early 20th century was the city of Freud and Wittgenstein, of Klimt and Schiele, of composers and mathematicians and architects who were all in the same rooms talking to each other. It was not just a capital city, it was a laboratory for human ideas. Her father, Emil Kiesler, was a successful bank director, a serious, educated man who moved comfortably in Viennese intellectual circles, who read broadly, argued enthusiastically, and believed that rigorous thinking was the highest form of human activity. Her mother, Gertrude, was a concert pianist who had trained formally and held high standards for everything she touched. They were Jewish. They were prosperous. They were, by every measure, part of the cultured European bourgeoisie that put its faith in education and in the power of the human mind to improve on whatever it found broken in the world. From the very beginning, Hedwig was different. She was curious in a way that went beyond normal childhood curiosity. She didn't just want to know how things worked. She needed to know, with the kind of physical restlessness that the genuinely gifted often have, the kind that makes sitting still in a classroom feel like a mild form of punishment. She was the child who disassembled a music box to see the mechanism inside and reassembled it correctly before her parents came home. The child who read ahead in every textbook and then showed up to class with questions the teacher couldn't answer. Her father recognized this early and, instead of managing it, fed it. He took her on long Sunday walks through Vienna, pointing out factories and tram systems and printing presses, explaining the mechanics of the city, how the electrical grid worked, how a telephone exchange routed tens of thousands of simultaneous calls, how a clockmaker's arrangement of springs and gears converted energy into the measurement of time. He took her to see textile mills, telegraph offices, engineering workshops. He treated her like a serious person from the time she was old enough to form a follow-up question. She said in an interview decades later that those walks were the most important education she ever received. Not formal school, not anything Hollywood gave her. Those Sunday mornings in Vienna with a man who believed his daughter could understand anything she chose to put her mind to. That belief, given consistently and without qualification from her earliest childhood, shaped everything that came after. She was also, obviously, extraordinarily beautiful. That's not something you can ignore or pretend didn't matter, because it mattered enormously, both in the doors it opened and the very specific trap it set for her that she spent her entire adult life navigating. By the time she was a teenager, people stopped on the street when she walked by. Her face had the kind of precision and contrast that photographers described in almost geometric terms. She started acting in local theater productions, then moved into film work. She was genuinely good at it, confident on camera, precise in her choices, with an instinct for emotional truth that required almost no direction. At 16, she walked into a film studio in Berlin and talked her way into a role, because that's the kind of person she was. Not someone who waited to be invited, someone who showed up at the door and made her case. In 1933, she made a film called Ecstasy that caused a scandal across Europe. She was 18 years old. The film contained a nude scene and became one of the most talked about, most controversial movies of its time. Suddenly, her name was everywhere, and so was the attention of powerful men who, throughout history, have always confused beauty with availability. One of those men was Friedrich Mandl. Let me tell you about Friedrich Mandl because you need to understand him to understand what Hedy became. Mandl was one of the wealthiest men in Austria. He was the head of a massive arms manufacturing company called Hirtenberger Patronenfabrik, which supplied weapons to some of the most dangerous regimes in Europe. He had business relationships with Mussolini's Italy. He had meetings with high-ranking Nazi officials. He sold ammunition, weapons systems, artillery components to anyone with enough money to buy them, and he didn't ask too many questions about what they planned to do with their purchases. He was 30 years old when he met Hedy. She was 18. Mandl was obsessive, controlling, possessive in the way that only very powerful and very insecure men can be. He bought her jewelry and fur coats and a mansion. He also bought her freedom, piece by piece, until there was none left. He controlled who she spent time with, what she wore, where she went. He reportedly bought up every existing print of Ecstasy he could find, trying to erase that film from history because he was humiliated by his wife's body being seen by other men. He wasn't a man who loved her. He was a man who owned her. or thought he did. But here's the thing that Mandl never understood, and this is the part that matters more than anything else in this section of the story. He brought her to every business meeting, every dinner table, every conference. He wanted her present as exhibition, as living proof of his success and taste and status. This famous and beautiful wife who made other powerful men envious. So he seated her at tables while he negotiated arms contracts with procurement officials from multiple governments. He put her in rooms where engineers presented technical briefings on naval torpedo guidance systems, where military strategists discussed the vulnerabilities of radio-controlled weapons in operational conditions, where intelligence advisors described how enemy navies could exploit those vulnerabilities to devastating effect. And while all of this happened around her, Hedy Lamarr sat in her silk and diamonds, speaking only when spoken to, appearing to every man in the room to be a decorative wife, taking no particular interest in the technical details. And she was memorizing everything. Not casually, not accidentally. She was filing information away with the precision and organization of a trained engineer, because the mind her father had built on those. Sunday morning walks in Vienna did not know how to waste what it heard. She absorbed the language of weapons systems. She learned the names of components. She understood, from repeated exposure, how a radio-controlled torpedo worked. The transmitter on the launching vessel sending a continuous signal on a fixed radio frequency, the receiver in the torpedo responding to that signal to adjust its course in real time. And she heard, from the engineers themselves, the vulnerability. If an enemy ship could identify that fixed frequency and broadcast a more powerful signal on the same band, it could overwhelm the guidance signal and send the torpedo spinning off course or cause it to detonate prematurely. She heard this described as an unsolved problem. She filed that away too, like a spy who hadn't been recruited yet, like a scientist who hadn't found her laboratory. It took her 6 years to get out. She tried to leave multiple times in the first 2 years of the marriage. Mandl caught her each time or blocked each attempt before she got far. He controlled her access to money, to her own passport, to any domestic staff whose first loyalty was to her rather than to him. She was imprisoned in luxury, which is a specific kind of misery very difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced the claustrophobia of captivity dressed in abundance. She had almost everything and could go nowhere. The escape, when it finally came, had all the drama of a movie scene, fitting for a woman who was also a movie star. The exact details have varied in different tellings over the years, but the core of the story is this. She drugged the maid who had been assigned to watch her, borrowed the woman's uniform, and walked out of the mansion disguised as a servant. She made her way to Paris, then to London. Then, on a ship crossing the Atlantic, she sat next to a man named Louis B. Mayer. Louis B. Mayer was the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, one of the biggest movie studios in Hollywood. He recognized her face immediately. She negotiated her own contract, in a foreign language, during that ocean crossing, holding out for better terms until she got the deal she wanted. When they docked in New York, she had a contract to become an MGM actress, and a new name, Hedy Lamarr, inspired partly by a silent film actress named Barbara Lamarr, whom Mayer admired for her dark beauty. She arrived in Hollywood in 1937 and became famous almost immediately. The phrase, "the most beautiful woman in the world," had been attached to her by European publications even before the Atlantic crossing, and MGM's publicity machine amplified it into a permanent fixture of American pop culture. She made Algiers in 1938 with Charles Boyer, and it launched her American career with the kind of critical and commercial success that established her as a genuine box office draw, not just a glamorous novelty. She followed it with a string of films across the early 1940s, Lady Of the Tropics, Comrade X, Tortilla Flat, Crossroads, and eventually Samson and Delilah in 1949, which became one of the highest-grossing pictures of the entire decade. She was, by any honest reckoning, one of the top stars in Hollywood for 15 years, but she was never comfortable staying inside the lane the studio had drawn for her. She kept thinking, she kept inventing. She redesigned a traffic light intersection and submitted the improvement to a city engineering office. She worked on a new design for a carbonated beverage tablet. She sketched ideas for aircraft aerodynamics on studio lunch napkins. She filed those ideas in notebooks she kept on her dressing table at the MGM lot, the same table covered in face powder and perfume bottles, a place where the two versions of her occupied exactly the same square footage without anyone on the outside ever noticing. And she kept going back, in the part of her mind that never fully turned off, not during filming, not during publicity events, not during the parties, to those dinners in the Austrian mansion, to the Torpedo guidance conversations, to the engineers who had described, in technical language she had never been expected to understand, a critical vulnerability in one of the Navy's most important weapons. To the question she had been turning over for years: what if you could make the radio signal impossible to jam by refusing to keep it on a single frequency long enough for anyone to target it? And now here's where this story turns, where it goes from remarkable to genuinely astonishing. In 1940, Hedy Lamarr was introduced to a man named George Antheil. Antheil was an avant-garde composer, a musical eccentric who had become famous in the 1920s for a concert piece called Ballet Mécanique that used 16 synchronized player pianos, airplane propellers, electric bells, and motors all performing at once. He was brilliant, strange, and completely unpredictable. They met at a dinner party in Hollywood and immediately connected over ideas. Hedy later said she admired that he thought the way she did, sideways, around corners, in directions that most people wouldn't go. They started meeting at her home to talk about the war. It was 1940, and Hitler was sweeping through Europe. Hedy felt it personally. She was Jewish. Her family was in Europe. France had just fallen. England was being bombed. She wanted to do something, not just sell war bonds or smile for recruitment posters, which the Navy had already suggested she do. She wanted to use her brain. She told Antheil about what she'd learned from those dinners with Mandl. She told him about radio-controlled torpedoes and how they worked. She told him about how a torpedo's radio signal could be jammed, how an enemy submarine or ship could broadcast on the same frequency, scramble the torpedo's guidance, make it go off course, or explode prematurely. She said she had an idea for a solution. What if the transmitter and the receiver both jumped frequencies, randomly, rapidly, in a pattern that was synchronized between them but impossible for an enemy to predict? If both sides of the communication were changing channels 88 times per second, jumping across the radio spectrum in a pattern that matched perfectly between the sender and receiver, there was nothing to jam. The signal was never on one frequency long enough to intercept. The torpedo would be unhackable. Antheil's eyes lit up. He knew exactly how to make synchronized, random-seeming pattern changes work. It was the same mechanical principle as his player pianos. If you could punch the pattern into a paper roll like a player piano roll, and install identical rolls in both the transmitter and the receiver, they would stay perfectly synchronized no matter what. They could jump frequencies in perfect lockstep, and the enemy would be listening to static. They worked on it together at her dining room table every Sunday for months. She paid for every material cost out of her own film salary, patent filing fees, engineering reference materials, the drafting tools. She ran the technical calculations and drew the circuit diagrams herself. Antheil contributed the player-piano synchronization mechanism and brought his mechanical engineering expertise to bear on making the concept physically workable. He later wrote in his personal diary that she was unambiguously the dominant technical mind in the collaboration. His contribution was the synchronization hardware idea, but the foundational intellectual breakthrough, the frequency hopping concept itself, came entirely and originally from her. It had been sitting in her mind since those Viennese dinner tables, waiting for the right collaborator. They called the invention a secret communication system. They documented it with the thoroughness and precision of people who intended to be taken seriously because they did intend to be taken seriously, even though neither of them was naive enough to assume that outcome would come easily. Now, if you're enjoying this story so far, and I know you are, because this is the kind of history they never taught in school, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button right now. We've got more than 40 years of this story still to go: the Navy, the rejection, the decades in the dark, the incredible ending, and I don't want you to miss a single second of it. Hit subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it keeps stories like this one coming. We're here every week with the history that got buried, the names that got forgotten, the women who won a war while nobody was watching. On June 10, 1941, Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil filed a patent application with the United States Patent Office. The patent number was 2,292,387. It was awarded on August 11, 1942, and assigned to the United States Navy. They signed over their patent rights without asking for a single dollar. They weren't doing it for money. There was a war on. People were dying. She had what she believed was a solution, and she gave it away completely. Think about that for a second. The biggest movie star in America, one of the highest-paid women in Hollywood, took an invention out of her own brain and handed it to the United States government free of charge because she wanted to help win the war. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't hold a press conference. She just signed the papers and handed them over. The Navy put the patent in a drawer and forgot about it. That's not a metaphor. That's not me being dramatic for effect. The United States Navy received a working, patented system for making torpedo guidance signals impossible to jam, and the people in charge of evaluating new weapons technology looked at it, noted that it was submitted by a Hollywood actress, and decided it was not worth pursuing. One official reportedly said the invention was too complicated to be fitted onto a torpedo. Another suggested, essentially, that she should go back to making movies and leave the engineering to the engineers. The patronizing dismissal of Hedy Lamarr by the United States Navy is one of the great acts of institutional arrogance in American military history. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because if you think about what was happening in 1942, American ships were being sunk in the Atlantic. The war in the Pacific was at a critical turning point. Every technological edge mattered. The idea that they shelved a working solution because it came from a woman who happened to also be famous is breathtaking. It is genuinely maddening. She was furious. She appealed. She wrote letters. She believed in the invention because she understood it at a level the evaluators did not. She had sat in those dinners in Vienna. She had heard the engineers describe the problem in their own words. She had built the solution from first principles in her own living room. And now a committee of men who couldn't explain frequency hopping if their careers depended on it were telling her to stick to making movies. She went back to making movies. She had no real alternative, but she never stopped believing she was right, and they were wrong. The distinction matters. This wasn't the resigned acceptance of someone who had decided to move on. She remained specifically and precisely certain that patent 292,387, described a working solution to a real problem that was getting American sailors killed, and that the committee of men who had dismissed it had done so for reasons that had nothing to do with the invention's merit. She carried that certainty with her, quietly but without softening it, for the next 50 years. Let's step back for a moment because I want to make sure you understand who this woman really was. Not just the inventor, not just the actress, but the actual full human being. Because the Hedy Lamarr, who walked out of that Navy office in 1942, was shaped by experiences that would have broken most people long before this point. After fleeing Mandl, she had left everything behind. Not just the mansion and the jewelry and the social position Europe had assigned her. She had walked away from her country, her primary language, her culture, every social connection she had built, every familiar street and institution and relationship from the first 23 years of her life. She had done it by necessity, in a disguise, with no time to plan, carrying almost nothing. And then she had rebuilt a complete life in America, in English, in an industry as brutal as it was glamorous, while carrying inside her a technical mind that no one around her was prepared to take seriously. That is a specific and remarkable act of will that tends to get overlooked in the shadow of the more dramatic parts of her story. The years of steady construction, learning the language, mastering the industry, building the career, maintaining the outward image while keeping the notebooks and the inventions and the real interior life running separately, required a discipline and a resilience that she never particularly advertised. Hollywood in the 1940s, as men of your generation know well, was a system of controlled images. Studios owned their talent in ways that seem almost feudal from the current distance. 7-year contracts that couldn't be broken, publicity departments that managed every aspect of your public persona. Louis B. Mayer had created a specific image for Hedy Lamarr, exotic, mysterious, elegantly foreign, the kind of beauty that made American men think of impossible places. And that image was enormously commercially successful, and it had absolutely no room in it for radio engineering and patent applications. Hollywood was glamorous and brutal in equal measure. The studio system of the 1940s is something that men who lived through that era understand intuitively. It was a business built on control, on keeping talent in line, on making sure that stars stayed within the image the studio had created for them. Louis B. Mayer had invented an image for Hedy Lamarr, and that image was exotic beauty, mysterious European femininity, the kind of woman who made American men think of foreign shores and impossible allure. There was no room in that image for radio patents and technical drawings. She married 6 times over her life. This gets cited frequently as shorthand for instability, and I think that framing does her a real injustice. She was searching, consistently and honestly, for a partnership that could contain the full dimensions of who she was, someone who could see and value both the woman in the evening gown and the woman at the drafting table, who understood that those two versions of the same person were inseparable, and that dismissing one meant you had never actually met her. She never found that person in any lasting way. That says less about her and more about the particular loneliness that extraordinary people sometimes carry in eras that aren't ready for them. She had 3 children throughout these marriages, and she loved them and was loved in return. Her son Anthony has spoken about her publicly in warm and specific terms, about her restlessness, her dark humor, her fundamental decency, the way she would go quiet at dinner and come back from wherever her mind had taken her with something drawn on a napkin. He described a woman who was never truly at ease in Hollywood, who found the perpetual performance of celebrity exhausting, who retreated into her mind constantly and could disappear for hours into a technical problem without appearing to have moved at all. He said you always knew when she had solved something because her whole posture would shift. She'd sit up, reach for whatever writing instrument was nearby, and start drawing whether the nearest surface was a notebook or a paper bag or a restaurant receipt. Because she never stopped working, even after the Navy rejection. Even after the patent expired in 1959, and yes, you heard that right, the patent expired, which means that anyone who ever used the technology after 1959 used it without owing her a single penny. Even after the war ended and her Hollywood career began its natural decline, and the world moved on to the next beautiful face and the next scandal, she kept inventing, she kept thinking, she kept writing in those notebooks. The Navy, it turned out, had finally learned how to read. In 1962, 20 years after Hedy and George Antheil submitted their patent, the United States Navy declassified a frequency-hopping communication system and began using it on military ships. The system was, in all its essential details, the system described in patent 2,292,387. The Navy does not appear to have announced this publicly. There was no ceremony. Nobody called Hedy Lamarr to say, "You were right, we were wrong, thank you." The patent had expired 3 years earlier. She received nothing. Think about the timing of that for a second. If the Navy had taken the patent seriously in 1942, she might have been compensated handsomely when it was used. If the patent had been in force when the Navy finally adopted the technology in 1962, she would have earned royalties on every communication device that used frequency-hopping spread spectrum. Instead, the 3-year gap between the patent expiring and the Navy adopting the system meant the window closed with mathematical precision. Some historians believe this was coincidental, others are not so sure. I want to pause here and check in with you because we're about halfway through this story, and I have to say, if you're a guy who remembers the Cold War, who remembers the Navy, who spent any time in uniform or just had family who served, the idea that an American woman handed the Navy a weapon they needed and got nothing in return should make your blood boil a little bit. That's the kind of injustice that men of your generation understood better than most, because you lived in a world where work got rewarded based on who you were, not just what you were worth. If this story is hitting you the way I think it is, take a second and subscribe. This channel is built on exactly these kinds of stories, the real ones, the ones that got buried, the ones where the history books got it wrong or left someone out entirely. Subscribe if you like what we're doing here. We need your support to keep going. The technology that Hedy Lamarr invented is not a footnote in military history. It is the foundation of the modern world. I need you to understand that fully before we go any further. Frequency-hopping spread spectrum, the system she developed in her living room with George Antheil using player piano rolls as the synchronization mechanism, is the fundamental principle behind Wi-Fi. It is the fundamental principle behind Bluetooth. It is the fundamental principle behind GPS. It is the reason you can make a cell phone call in a crowded stadium without your signal being jammed by everyone else's phone. It is the reason a military drone can receive commands in the middle of a war zone without the enemy scrambling its controls. It is the reason modern digital communication works at all. Every time you connect your phone to a wireless network, every time you put in wireless earbuds, every time you watch a video on a tablet without plugging it into anything, you are using a system that originated in Hedy Lamarr's mind. A mind that had been trained, without anyone's permission, at the dinner tables of Europe's most dangerous arms dealers. A mind that the United States Navy called too complicated. George Antheil died in 1959, the same year the patent expired, never having seen the technology used and never having received any recognition for it. He is buried in a modest grave. He was a genuinely brilliant and strange man who deserved better. Hedy Lamarr lived long enough to see what happened next. In the 1980s, as wireless technology began to take shape, engineers started rediscovering the patents and papers from the 1940s. The name Lamarr kept appearing. Researchers began tracing the lineage of spread-spectrum technology and found, every single time, that the trail led back to that 1942 patent. Back to a Hollywood actress and an eccentric composer working in a living room. Back to knowledge she had gathered as a prisoner in an Austrian mansion, sitting silently at dinner tables while powerful men talked about weapons. The academic papers started coming out. Then the technology journalists started writing about it. Then it went mainstream in a way that nobody, certainly not Hedy in her old age, expected. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation gave Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil its annual Pioneer Award. The EFF was, at the time, one of the most respected organizations in the technology world, and the Pioneer Award recognized individuals whose work had fundamentally shaped digital rights and communication history. It was the first significant public institutional acknowledgement that her invention had not simply contributed to military technology, but had become the foundation of the modern wireless communication world. She was 82 years old. She was living in Castleberry, Florida, partially withdrawn from public life, dealing with the health complications that come with advanced age, not widely known to younger generations who had no particular reason to have her name in their frame of reference. When the EFF announcement came, people who knew her said she was astonished, not by the fact of recognition, which she had stopped expecting somewhere in the previous decade, but by the scale of what was being attributed to her. She had always known the invention was real. She had always known it was important. She had simply not tracked in real time how completely it had propagated through and then beneath the entire modern communication world, becoming so foundational that it had become invisible. She could not travel to attend the ceremony in person, but she sent written remarks that have been preserved and quoted widely since. She said she was glad the work had proven useful. She said she wished George had lived to hear it. And she dwelled on that a moment longer than she dwelled on anything about herself. She said she remained, and she used the specific word angry at the Navy. Not generically bitter about the past. Specifically, precisely, 55 years later, still angry at the institution that had taken a working invention and put it in a drawer because the inventor was a woman whose face they recognized from the movies. That same year, 1997, she was also inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. She is one of a very small number of people to be recognized both for entertainment achievement and scientific contribution. There is nobody else quite like her in American history. The combination of what she was and what she accomplished exists in a category of exactly one. In 1998, the WiLAN company, recognizing that their technology descended from her patent work, gave her a financial settlement. The details were never made public. It was described as a token gesture. By any honest measure, it was far too little and far too late. But she accepted it with something approaching grace. And in several interviews from that period, she talked about the money not as compensation, but as confirmation. Confirmation that what she had done was real, was important, was worth remembering. She died on January 19, 2000, in her home in Castleberry, Florida. She was 85 years old. She had survived Friedrich Mandl, the Atlantic crossing, the studio system, the Navy's rejection, the Cold War, the decades of invisibility, the late-life humiliations, and the long, slow accumulation of recognition that came decades too late to fully compensate for what had been withheld. She had lived long enough to hear her name attached accurately to the wireless revolution that was reshaping the world. She had lived long enough to hear someone say, in public and officially, that the technology was hers, and the credit was hers, and the record should reflect that. Her son Anthony brought her ashes back to Vienna, as she had asked. He scattered a portion of them in the Vienna woods, the old forests on the edge of the city where Viennese people have walked for centuries when they needed to breathe, to think, to be in quiet. She had left Vienna in 1937 in a stolen uniform, running for her life. She had asked to come home in the only form that remained available. He gave her that. She is buried in Hietzing Cemetery near the city center, close to the streets she would have known as a child, not far from the coffee houses where Emil Kiesler walked his curious daughter through the mechanics of the world on Sunday mornings before the world broke apart. For years, the grave was visited quietly by the small number of people who already knew the story. Then the documentaries came. Then the academic papers reached a general audience. Then the wireless revolution became so ubiquitous and so enormous that the question of where it came from could no longer be avoided. The accurate record accumulated piece by piece until it became undeniable, and then until it became common knowledge, which is the slow and imperfect way that buried truths eventually surface. Let me tell you what the Navy's dismissal of her patent actually cost. In the years between 1942 and 1962, when the Navy finally adopted frequency-hopping technology for its ships, the German military successfully jammed American torpedo guidance systems on multiple occasions in the Atlantic theater. We will never know precisely how many ships were lost, how many sailors died, how many missions failed, because the Navy had a working solution in its files and chose not to use it. The number of preventable deaths that resulted from institutional arrogance and sexism is not a number that anyone in authority has ever been willing to calculate publicly, but it is not zero. After the 1962 adoption, frequency hopping became standard in classified military communication platforms. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, American naval vessels operating in the Caribbean used spread-spectrum communication protocols to coordinate blockade operations in ways that were significantly more secure against Soviet electronic interference than anything available during World War II. Think about what was at stake in those 13 days in October, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear conflict. And consider that the communication technology, keeping American naval forces coordinated in real time, had its roots in a patent that had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 2 decades. The Soviets had enormous electronic warfare capabilities during the Cold War, Americans secure. Communication was a genuine strategic advantage. And that advantage traced back to 1942, back to a living room in Hollywood, back to a woman the Navy had laughed at. During the entire Cold War, from the early 1960s through 1991, American submarines operating in Soviet-patrolled waters relied on frequency-hopping communication methods for their most sensitive operational exchanges. Surface ships in every theater used spread-spectrum techniques for command and control. American forces in Vietnam used communications equipment derived from these principles. Desert Storm in 1991, Bosnia, Kosovo. The secure digital radio networks that American soldiers carried in the Gulf War and that gave them such a decisive edge in electronic warfare, all of it in a direct engineering lineage, goes back to patent 2,292,387. In every military conflict from Korea through the Gulf War through Iraq and Afghanistan, the American military's communication security advantage against adversaries who were actively trying to jam and intercept had the same grandmother, a Hollywood actress who had been told to go back to making movies. There's something I want to say to the men watching this, because I think it matters, and because nobody says it plainly enough. A lot of guys who grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, your generation, were taught a particular story about World War II. The story had specific heroes. They were mostly men. They wore uniforms. They flew planes and drove tanks and stormed beaches. That story is true and it's important, and the men in it deserve every tribute they've ever received. But the story was always incomplete. It was always leaving someone out. The women's contribution to winning World War II was not incidental. It was not decorative. The women who worked in the factories, the women who cracked codes at Bletchley Park, the women who flew planes for the Air Transport Auxiliary, the women who ran resistance cells in occupied France, the women who operated as spies behind enemy lines, and yes, the woman who invented the technology that made Allied military communication unbreakable, these women were not supporting the war effort. They were fighting it. They were winning it. They were doing it in a world that refused to give them credit, and most of them went to their graves without ever receiving what they had earned. That's not a political statement. That's just history. And men of your generation, men who actually lived close enough to that era to remember what it smelled like, men who had fathers and uncles and grandfathers who served, you understand the value of honoring what's real. You understand that a man who died without credit for what he did deserves to be remembered. The same principle applies to a woman. Hedy Lamarr deserved better from the country she served. She received it, in pieces, in the final years of her life. But the weight of what was withheld from her, the decades of silence while the world used her invention and didn't say her name, is part of her story, too. It is, in fact, the part of the story that makes her more impressive rather than less, because she never stopped working, never stopped believing in what she had built, and never stopped being angry at the right people for the right reasons, even when anger was the only return she was getting on the investment. Before we get to the recognition that finally came, I need to check in with you one more time. Because if you've been with this story for the last however long, if you've followed Hedy Lamarr from Vienna to Hollywood, to the Navy offices, to the Florida apartment, then you are exactly the kind of audience this channel was built for. The guys who want the real version, the guys who aren't satisfied with the summary, the guys who know that the most important stories are usually the ones that didn't make the front page. If that's you, hit subscribe right now. It's the way you tell us to keep doing what we're doing. Every subscription is a vote for more stories like this one. We post every week. Good stuff, every time. Hit that button and you'll never miss one. And it's almost criminal that for most of those years, the public image of Hedy Lamarr was built entirely on her face. The magazine spreads, the movie stills, the photographs of those extraordinary cheekbones and those dark eyes that the MGM publicity department reproduced on posters and lobby cards and the covers of fan magazines. That was the Hedy Lamarr that most Americans knew in the 1940s through the 1970s. The beautiful one. The face. The engineer was invisible. She gave exactly 2 interviews about the invention during the height of her fame, and in both cases the journalists seemed more interested in how she balanced being a genius with being gorgeous, as though the 2 things were an impossible combination that required a special explanation. She found those questions exhausting. She found the entire framework exhausting. The constant need to frame her intelligence as surprising, as anomalous, as something that required justifying in the context of her appearance. She once said, and this is a quote that anyone can verify and that has been repeated correctly in dozens of biographies, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." She was being sardonic. She was being exact. She was naming the specific trap that her face had set for her from the moment she became famous, the assumption that beauty and intellect exist in inverse proportion, that having more of one means having less of the other, and that the amount of either determines how seriously a person should be taken. She never accepted that assumption, not for a single day of her life. She pushed against it constantly, in her notebooks, in the patent filing, in the letters to the Navy, in the years of continued inventing after the rejection, in the way she described herself in every interview that bothered to ask about anything other than her face. The assumption was wrong, and she knew it was wrong, and she refused to pretend otherwise, even in a world that would have been considerably easier for her to navigate if she had. Her childhood in Vienna had given her a father who valued her mind and built it carefully on those Sunday walks. Her years with Mandl had given her an involuntary education in some of the most sophisticated weapons technology in Europe. Her escape had given her self-reliance of a kind that cannot be acquired any other way. The specific confidence of a person who once had nothing and built everything from scratch with their own hands and their own intelligence. And Hollywood had given her resources she used for purposes the studio never intended: a salary large enough to fund her own patent filings, a living room large enough to work in, a name famous enough that when recognition finally came, 50 years late and inadequate, the world paid enough attention to hear it. The same celebrity that had been used to dismiss her was ultimately used to amplify her. History works that way sometimes, slowly and with poor timing, but it works. There is a documentary about her called Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story, released in 2017 and directed by Alexandra Dean. It includes audio recordings of phone conversations Dean had with Hedy in the mid-1990s. If you ever have 90 minutes to sit down with a piece of history that will genuinely rewrite how you see someone, watch it. The recordings are unlike anything you'd expect. She's sharp, she's funny, she's precise, she's working through technical ideas in real time during casual conversation. She sounds like what she was: a brilliant, restless, thoroughly unlucky mind that happened to also be famous for the wrong reasons, speaking clearly and without self-pity about what she had done and what had been done to her. Here's something that gets overlooked in most tellings of this story. And if you've been with us this long, you know we don't do the version where things get left out. In the years between inventing the secret communication system and receiving the EFF Pioneer Award, Hedy Lamarr filed multiple other patents. She was not a one-hit wonder in the world of invention. She worked on improvements to aviation communication systems. She worked on a design for a carbonated drink tablet. She submitted proposals to military engineering departments on at least 2 other occasions and was, at least according to documents that have come to light since her death, politely ignored both times. The frequency-hopping patent was not a lucky accident. It was the most visible product of a mind that was simply constitutionally incapable of remaining still. She thought about problems the way other people breathe, automatically, continuously, without deciding to. George Antheil once described sitting with her at a dinner party and watching her go quiet in the middle of a conversation. Her eyes go slightly unfocused, and knowing from experience that she had just seen a solution to something she'd been working on for weeks. She would pick up a napkin, pull out a pencil from her purse, and start drawing. She said that her mind was the thing she trusted most and the thing that caused her the most pain, because a mind like hers in the world she inhabited was constantly hitting walls built by studios who wanted her to be a face and not a person, walls built by military officials who couldn't imagine that intelligence could come wrapped in the kind of beauty that made men stop thinking. Walls built by a culture that had very specific ideas about what women were for and refused to update those ideas even when presented with overwhelming evidence. She knocked down every wall she could reach. The ones she couldn't knock down, she went around. Now, and I say this knowing that we're deep into this story now, knowing that you've sat with Hedy, Lamarr, through Vienna and Mandl and Hollywood and the Navy's rejection and the long silence and the final recognition. I want to give you the moment that I think captures everything. The moment that, to me, defines who she was more than any movie still or any technical diagram. It's 1997. Hedy Lamarr is 82 years old. She's in Florida. She's not well. She seldom leaves the house. Her great days as a movie star are 50 years behind her. Her great days as a recognized inventor are, at this point in the story, about 48 hours in the future, because the EFF announcement is coming. But she doesn't know that yet. A documentary filmmaker named Alexandra Dean managed to record a phone call with Hedy in the period just before the recognition finally arrived, and what Dean described was a woman who was still fighting, still angry, still absolutely convinced, at 82, that the work mattered and that history had gotten it wrong. She talked about the Navy with a precision and a bitterness that suggested she had replayed those conversations in her head thousands of times over 50 years. She talked about the patent with technical fluency that stopped Dean cold because she had expected nostalgia and received instead an active, engaged, engineering mind that had lost none of its sharpness with age. She said she was glad she'd lived long enough to see the wireless world. She said it was satisfying in a quietly devastating way to turn on a laptop or hold a cordless phone and know where that came from. She said the only part that bothered her, that still kept her up some nights, was thinking about George, about the fact that George Antheil had died in 1959 without knowing, that the man who had helped her build the mechanical solution, who had brought his player pianos and his eccentric genius to bear on a problem that would reshape the world, had gone to his grave without ever hearing anyone say, "You did something that mattered." That's who Hedy Lamarr was in the end, not bitter about herself, bitter for someone else, still thinking about her collaborator, her friend, 38 years after his death, still carrying the injustice on his behalf because he wasn't there to carry it himself. If that doesn't move you, I genuinely don't know what will. Let me give you the numbers because they matter and they put everything in context. The global wireless communication market today, encompassing Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular networks, GPS, all of it, is valued at somewhere in the range of $2 trillion annually. Every major technology company in the world, Apple, Google, Samsung, Qualcomm, Intel, every cellular carrier from AT&T to Verizon, operates in an industry whose technical foundation runs in a direct and documentable engineering line back to patent 2,292,387. The patent that Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil submitted in June of 1941 at their own expense, freely, unconditionally, because there was a war on and people were dying. Let me be very specific about what that means in practical terms. The IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which is essentially the professional standards body for the entire global electronics industry, has formally recognized Hedy Lamarr's contribution to the development of spread-spectrum communication. The Wi-Fi Alliance, the organization that certifies wireless networking equipment, traces the lineage of its protocols to spread-spectrum innovations that descend directly from her patent. The Bluetooth Special Interest Group, which oversees the development of Bluetooth standards used in billions of devices worldwide, acknowledges the same origin. GPS technology, developed by the United States Department of Defense and now used by everyone from long-haul truckers to hikers to the navigation app on your phone, relies on spread-spectrum principles for its signal integrity. Every one of these technologies, every device in your house that connects wirelessly to anything, all of it, By the most conservative estimates, if Hedy Lamarr had retained the commercial rights to her invention and been paid at even a fraction of its actual market value, she would have been one of the wealthiest 20 people in American history. She would have been wealthier than most of the movie stars she worked alongside, wealthier than most of the studio executives who tried to define her, wealthier by orders of magnitude than the Navy officials who put her patent in a drawer. Instead, she received a token settlement in her 80s, an award from a digital rights organization, and a statue in a European city that most Americans could not locate on a map without help. The gap between what she deserved and what she received is not just a personal injustice. It's a precise measurement of how much a society is willing to lose by deciding, based entirely on the wrong information, that certain people don't deserve to be heard. There is a Hedy Lamarr Day now. It's November 9th, her birthday, and it's formally recognized in Austria and Germany and in several American states as a celebration of women in technology and innovation. Her name appears on university engineering department walls. There are graduate scholarships in her name at technical institutions she never attended, funded by companies that owe their entire existence to the technology she invented. There are engineering awards. There is a crater on Venus named after her, Lamarr Crater, which is the kind of recognition that would have made her laugh and then immediately ask something sharp about how craters are named and who decides. There is, finally, a statue in Vienna near the Palais Schwarzenberg, not far from the coffee houses where her father used to take her on Sunday mornings to explain how the world worked. The statue shows her the way the city wants to remember her now, not as a movie star, not as a scandal, but as a scientist. Thinker. A woman who looked at a problem that was killing people and built a solution out of nothing but pure intelligence and a refusal to be told she wasn't capable. I've told you this story because I think you need to hear it. Not because it's politically convenient, not because someone told me to bring it up, but because if you're a man who loves history, who has spent time with the real stories of World War II, the ones about what it actually cost, what it actually took, who actually did the work, then Hedy Lamarr belongs in your mental library alongside the generals and the pilots and the soldiers whose names you already know. More than that, she belongs at the top of the list, because what she gave to the war effort and to the world that came after it was not a single moment of bravery in the heat of battle. It was a decade of quiet, private intellectual labor that no one asked her to perform, followed by a lifetime of carrying the knowledge that she had been right, while the world told her she was just a pretty face. That kind of sustained, unrewarded, unacknowledged contribution to the common good is a specific species of heroism, and it deserves to be called by its name without qualification or hedging. She was also, just to be completely clear, a better engineer on her worst day than any of the evaluators who dismissed her patent were on their best. That's not a compliment to her. It's an accounting of the record. The technology she described in 1942 worked exactly as she said it would. The principles she applied were sound. The mechanical implementation she proposed with Antheil was subsequently updated to use electronics rather than paper rolls, which is simply a reflection of how much electronics advanced between 1942 and 1962. But the fundamental invention was correct. A committee of men who couldn't explain it correctly rejected it anyway. That is the documented history, and there's no charitable reading of it. She was an actress who could have coasted on her face for her entire career and died wealthy and adored without ever troubling herself with circuit diagrams or Navy offices or legal patent filings. She could have chosen the easier life at every turn. She didn't, because she was her father's daughter, because those Sunday walks through Vienna had taught her that understanding how things work is not a hobby, it's a responsibility. One last thing before we close today, because this is the detail that I keep coming back to, the one that gets me every time I tell this story. When Hedy Lamarr died in 2000, her obituaries in the major newspapers led with her face. The most beautiful woman in the world, movie star of the golden age, femme fatale. Every photograph they ran was from a film still or a glamour shoot. The technology, when it was mentioned at all, was typically in the third or fourth paragraph, described as a curious footnote to a glamorous life. That's what the official record looked like in 2000. Today, in 2026, if you type her name into any search engine, the first thing that comes up is inventor. The second thing is Wi-Fi. The third thing is spread spectrum. The beautiful face is still there, in image searches, because the face is still remarkable. But the story has finally been reorganized around the truth. The mind is first, the invention is first, the work is first. It took 100 years. It took the wireless world becoming so ubiquitous that even people who didn't care about history had to acknowledge where it came from. It took documentary filmmakers and engineers and technology journalists doing the work that military historians had avoided. But it happened. The record got corrected. Hedy Lamarr would be pleased, I think. Not satisfied. She was never someone who did satisfied, but pleased. She would probably want to remind you that she called it in 1942. She would probably want you to know that she was never confused about her own capabilities, not for a single day, even when everyone around her was. She would probably say something dryly funny and then change the subject to something she was currently working on. That's the woman the history books owe us, not the glamour, not the scandal, not the beautiful face looking serenely out of a movie still. A woman with a pencil and a patent application and 50 years of knowing she was right before anyone believed her. A woman who understood her own mind better than any institution she ever dealt with understood it, and who kept working and kept building and kept believing in the work even when there was no external evidence that the belief was justified. The patience required for that is something most people will never be asked to demonstrate. She demonstrated it for 5 decades without slowing down. A 27-year-old actress sitting in a living room in Hollywood, surrounded by technical drawings and player piano rolls, building the future while the United States Navy told her to go, back to making movies. They laughed at her torpedo idea, until they realized she had outsmarted every engineer in the room, and then they used her technology and said nothing for 20 years. History has a long memory, and so do we. If this story hit you the way I think it should, if you learned something today, if Hedy Lamarr is now on your list of names that matter, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. We do this every week. Stories like this one, the ones that got buried, the names that got forgotten, the women who won a war while nobody was watching. It means everything to have you here. Hit subscribe if you liked this video. Leave a comment with the name of the woman in history you want us to cover next. I read every single one. We'll see you on the next one. Don't go anywhere.